Mary, are you sure about this? My best friend, Lucy, asked as we sat in my small, but cozy living room. The walls were lined with bookshelves, a testament to my love for fantasy and writing. I sighed, pushing a lock of hair behind my ear. About marrying Alex? Yeah, I am. But his family? That's a whole different story. Lucy raised an eyebrow, her skepticism clear. Especially his mom, huh? I nodded. Mrs. Thompson, Alex's mother, she's something else. Always prying, always judging. And don't get me started on the wedding plans. The doorbell rang, and in came Mrs. Thompson, as if on cue, with her usual air of self-importance. Mary, dear, we need to talk about the wedding dress, she said, barely a hello. I braced myself. What about it, Mrs. Thompson? She waved a dismissive hand. The one you chose, it's just not suitable. I found the perfect one yesterday. It's only a bit over your budget. A bit? I asked, dreading the answer. Well, it's double your budget. But it's worth it, she declared, her tone leaving no room for argument. I exchanged a helpless look with Lucy. Mrs. Thompson, I can't afford that. Nonsense, she snapped. It's your special day. You can cut corners elsewhere. This dress is a must. Feeling cornered, I reluctantly agreed. It was easier than arguing. The next day, we went to the bridal shop. The dress was indeed beautiful, but the price tag made my stomach churn. As I tried it on, Mrs. Thompson gushed over how stunning I looked. It's settled then, she said, clapping her hands together. We'll take it. I hesitated. But the price, Mrs. Thompson. Don't you worry, she interrupted, I'll help you out. Consider it my gift to you. Relief washed over me. Maybe I had misjudged her. Fast forward to the wedding day, the dress was a hit. Everyone complimented me, and I felt like a princess. But after the wedding, when I approached Mrs. Thompson about the dress payment, she conveniently forgot her promise. Mary, dear, I never said I'd pay for the whole thing. I said I'd help. You know, with the choosing. I was flabbergasted. But you said. She waved me off. You must have misunderstood. Anyway, it's done now. No use crying over spilt milk. I stood there, feeling cheated and foolish. Lucy was right. I should have been more careful. It was a Thursday, just like any other, except it wasn't. I was in my home office, the smallest room in the house, cluttered with my writing stuff. The only place where I could find some peace, or so I thought. The sound of the doorbell shattered the quiet. I knew who it was without even looking. Mrs. Thompson had this habit of showing up unannounced, as if our house was a public park. Mary, dear, I'm here, she bellowed from the living room, not bothering to wait for me to answer the door. I took a deep breath, preparing myself for the ordeal ahead. Hi, Mrs. Thompson, I greeted, trying to sound pleasant. Oh, there you are, hiding in your little room, she said, peering around with a look of disdain. You really should get out more, dear. I forced a smile. I'm actually quite busy with my writing. Writing, schmitting. She waved her hand dismissively. You need to live a little. Now, where's the remote? I want to catch my show. As she plopped onto the sofa, turning on the TV, I couldn't help but feel a surge of irritation. My home was turning into her daytime retreat. Mrs. Thompson, I was hoping to get some work done today, I said, trying to sound firm yet polite. She looked at me, her eyebrows raised. Oh, don't be silly. Your little stories can wait. I need to relax. You know, I save so much on my electricity bill coming here. I was at a loss for words. The audacity was astounding. And to make matters worse, she headed straight for the kitchen next. What's for lunch, Mary? I'm starving, she called out, rummaging through the fridge. I followed her, my frustration growing. Mrs. Thompson, I haven't prepared lunch yet. I was planning to eat later. She shrugged, pulling out ingredients. No problem, I'll make do with whatever you have. You should really stock up better, though. There I was, watching her take over my kitchen, using my groceries. The sense of intrusion was overwhelming. Alex walked in just then, home for lunch. "Mom, what are you doing here?" he asked, surprise evident in his voice. "Just visiting, darling. Mary and I are having a lovely time," she lied smoothly. I glanced at Alex, hoping he'd say something, but he just shrugged and sat down, turning his attention to the TV. It was clear where he stood, or rather, where he chose to sit, firmly on the fence. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow into my small home office. The walls, lined with shelves of fantasy novels and manuscripts, seemed to close in on me as I sat there, typing away. My world of mythical creatures and grand adventures was a sharp contrast to the reality I was living. The door to my sanctuary burst open with a force that made me jump. Mrs. Thompson stormed in, her face twisted in a mix of disgust and irritation. "Mary, what in the world are you still doing cooped up in here? It's like you're married to that damn computer. There's a real world out there, you know," she exclaimed, her voice laced with contempt. I sighed, pausing my typing. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm working. This is my job, my career." She let out a derisive snort. "Job? You call sitting on your behind all day, making up fairy tales, a job? That's the biggest load of rubbish I've ever heard." I tried to keep my voice steady. "Writing is a legitimate profession. I'm a published author. It's not just a hobby." She rolled her eyes dramatically. "Published, schmublished. All this nonsense about dragons and magic wands. It's child's play. Get a real job, contribute something useful to society." Her words were like a barrage of arrows, each one striking its mark. Before I could muster a response, my husband Alex walked in, his expression mirroring his mother's disapproval. "What's the racket about?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. "Your wife here thinks she's doing the world a favor with her silly stories," Mrs. Thompson said, waving a dismissive hand at my computer. Alex's gaze fell on me, cold and judgmental. "Mary, Mom's right. This isn't a real job. When are you going to stop living in this fantasy world and do something worthwhile?" I felt a knot form in my stomach. "Alex, I am doing something worthwhile. I'm a writer. My books are sold internationally." He let out a cynical laugh. "International? Please, don't make me laugh. How much do you even make from these so-called books?" "It's a joke." I clenched my fists, trying to control the rising tide of anger and frustration. "My writing does contribute. It's not just about the money. It's my passion, my life's work." Alex shook his head, an expression of mock pity on his face. "Passion won't pay the bills, Mary. It's time you grew up and got a proper job, one that pays regularly." The conversation was going in circles, their words cutting deeper each time. I felt like I was being suffocated, my dreams and aspirations trampled under their relentless criticism. "Look, I don't need this," I finally said, standing up. "I don't need to justify my career to anyone." Alex raised an eyebrow. "Oh, so now you're getting defensive? Classic. When you can't face the truth, you just run away." I bit back a sharp retort, knowing it would only fuel their fire. Mrs. Thompson, sensing my defeat, added one last jab. "Think about what we said, Mary. It's for your own good. You can thank us later when you're living in the real world." With that, they left, leaving me alone in my office, surrounded by my books, my work, my world. But their words echoed in the room, each syllable a reminder of how little they understood or respected me. I wondered how much longer I could endure this environment, where my aspirations were nothing but a source of ridicule. The future, once bright with possibilities, now seemed dim and uncertain. It was a typical Saturday morning, the kind that usually promised relaxation and peace. But for me, it heralded the start of the dreaded weekend ritual. The clock had barely struck 10 when I heard the familiar commotion at the front door. It was Susan, Alex's sister, with her 3 kids in tow. Hey, Mary, Susan called out cheerily as she barged in, the kids already scattering to different corners of the house. Hope we're not too early. I forced a smile, hiding my dismay. No, not at all. Good morning, everyone. Susan, oblivious to my discomfort, plopped herself on the sofa. Phew, what a week. I'm beat. The kids have been driving me up the wall. Thank God for Saturdays, right? I nodded, a sense of resignation settling in. Right. Would you like some coffee? That'd be great, thanks, she said, already engrossed in her phone. As I made my way to the kitchen, dodging toys and narrowly avoiding a collision with the youngest, I couldn't help but feel like an unpaid nanny and housekeeper. By the time I returned with the coffee, the living room resembled a war zone. Susan looked up, unfazed by the chaos. Oh, Mary, could you whip up some of your pancakes? The kids are starving. It wasn't a request, it was an expectation. Sure, I'll get started on that, I replied, my weekend plans vanishing like smoke. The kitchen became my battleground as I juggled pancakes, coffee, and managing the kids. Amidst the flipping and serving, Alex sauntered in, his expression sour. Mary, why do you always buy these expensive ingredients? We need to cut down on expenses, he grumbled, eyeing the breakfast spread. I sighed, trying to keep my frustration in check. Alex, your sister and her kids eat here every weekend. It adds up. He shrugged, dismissive. Well, they're family. You can make do with less fancy stuff. Save some money. The rest of the day passed in a blur of cooking, cleaning, and catering to endless demands. By the time Susan herded her kids out the door, I was drained, both physically and emotionally. As I slumped onto the couch, Alex walked over, a frown on his face. You know, you have to save some money on my nephews and my sister. I looked at him, incredulous. Me? You're the one who never says no to her. And you criticize me for spending too much? He rolled his eyes. Just trying to help you manage better. You could learn to be more economical, you know. The irony of his words was almost laughable. There I was, running a weekend daycare and diner, and he was lecturing me on being economical. I wanted to scream, to tell him how unfair it all was. But I knew it would fall on deaf ears. The house was finally quiet, a stark contrast to the usual daytime chaos. It was my time, the only time I could dedicate to my writing without interruptions. The clock ticked past midnight as I settled into my office, the soft glow of the computer screen my only companion. As I lost myself in the world of my creation, the door creaked open. Alex stood there, his face a mix of annoyance and fatigue. Mary, are you seriously still up? You know how much this will spike our electricity bill? I exhaled slowly, trying to keep my cool. It's the only time I have, Alex. You know how hectic it gets during the day. He leaned against the doorframe, his expression hardening. Hectic? You mean, taking care of your family? That's what you're supposed to do, Mary. And this night owl routine, it's not helping. Think about the bills, for once. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The bills? Really, Alex? That's your concern right now? Not the fact that I'm sacrificing my sleep, my health, to pursue my career? He rolled his eyes. Career? You mean this little hobby of yours? Come on, Mary. Be realistic. You need to get your priorities straight. I felt a surge of frustration. This hobby of mine is important to me, Alex. It's my passion, my work. Can't you see that? He shook his head, dismissive. All I see is unnecessary expenses and a wife who's more interested in her fantasies than her family. The hurt from his words was palpable. I stood up, facing him. My writing is part of who I am, Alex. I can't just give it up because you think it's impractical. He snorted. Impractical is an understatement. It's a waste of time and money. You could be doing something more productive, you know. I felt a lump in my throat, the words stinging like a physical blow. I am being productive, in my own way. Why can't you understand that? Alex shrugged, a cold, indifferent gesture. Maybe I would, if it actually brought in some real money. Until then, it's just a nuisance. With that, he turned and left, leaving me alone in the dimly lit room. The words on the screen blurred as tears pricked my eyes. I was struggling to keep my dream alive, and the person who was supposed to support me the most just didn't get it. The kitchen was stifling, the air thick with tension. I was stirring the pot when Alex came in, his mother, Mrs. Thompson, trailing behind him like a shadow. The news he dropped was like a bombshell. Susan and her husband are taking off for 2 weeks. They need us to watch the kids, Alex announced, a note of finality in his voice. I froze, spoon in hand. 2 weeks? That's a huge ask, Alex. Mrs. Thompson chimed in immediately, her tone sharp. It's family, Mary. You can't say no to family. I could feel the frustration building up. But my writing, I have deadlines. I can't be a full-time babysitter. Alex scoffed, his voice dripping with sarcasm. You're writing? Come on, Mary. It's not like you're penning the next bestseller. Family comes first. I turned to Mrs. Thompson, seeking some support. Maybe the kids could stay with you? She recoiled as if I'd suggested something outrageous. Me? Look after 3 young ones at my age? Absolutely not. I've done my time raising kids. Desperate, I grasped at another solution. What about hiring a nanny then? Just for those 2 weeks. Both of them looked at me as if I'd grown a second head. A nanny? Mrs. Thompson spat out the word. Why waste money on that when you're already here? Alex nodded in agreement. Exactly. We're not made of money, Mary. You need to be sensible about this. I was incredulous. Sensible? You're asking me to give up 2 weeks of my life, my work, for free, and I'm the one who needs to be sensible? Alex's face hardened. It's not a negotiation, Mary. This is what families do for each other. You're part of this family, or have you forgotten? I felt a surge of anger. No, Alex, I haven't forgotten. But it seems like you've forgotten that I have a life and commitments of my own. Mrs. Thompson snorted. Commitments? To those fanciful scribblings of yours? Don't be so dramatic. It's just 2 weeks of babysitting. Feeling cornered, I raised my voice. It's not just babysitting. It's my time, my career. Why can't either of you understand that? Alex's expression turned cold. Because, Mary, in the real world, people don't get to live in their fantasy land. They make sacrifices. They do what's necessary for family. I was shaking with frustration. And what about what's necessary for me? Don't my dreams and aspirations matter to you at all? He leaned in, his voice a low threat. If you don't do this, Mary, it's over. I'll file for divorce. Is that what you want? I recoiled, his words hitting me like a physical blow. The threat of divorce hung in the air, a brutal ultimatum. The day the kids were supposed to arrive felt like the calm before the storm. I watched from the window as Susan's car pulled up. Out tumbled her 3 little ones, each more energetic than the last. Mrs. Thompson, playing the doting grandmother, welcomed them with open arms. The scene was almost comical, a perfect setup for what I had planned. Mary, darling, could you help with the kids? Mrs. Thompson called out, her voice saccharine sweet. I plastered a smile on my face, hiding my brewing plan. Of course, I'll be right there. As I walked into the living room, the chaos was already unfolding. The kids were running around, and Mrs. Thompson looked like she was barely holding it together. Finally, Mary, I thought you'd never come, she snapped, her kind facade slipping. Alex walked in, his expression a mix of annoyance and relief. Mary, make sure they don't wreck the place. I'm going to be in my office. I nodded, my heart racing with anticipation. Actually, I need to go out for a bit. I'll be back soon. Alex's face twisted into a scowl. Go out? Now? Are you kidding me, Mary? You can't leave us with all this. I shrugged, feigning nonchalance. It's just for a bit, Alex. I need to buy some groceries. You'll manage, won't you? Mrs. Thompson glared at me. You're being completely irresponsible, Mary. This is not the time for your little shopping trips. Ignoring her, I grabbed my purse. I won't be long. Keep an eye on the kids. I couldn't help but let out a laugh as I closed the door behind me. The look on their faces was priceless. I didn't go shopping. Instead, I headed straight to the apartment I had rented days before. I had moved all my belongings there when no one was home. It was my escape, my fresh start. Sitting in my new, empty apartment, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The laughter, the sense of freedom was exhilarating. I was finally free from their suffocating grip. I knew Alex would find the divorce papers I left in my office. I imagined his shock, his anger, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. I had taken control of my life again. The phone rang incessantly, messages flooded in Alex, Mrs. Thompson, even Susan. But I ignored them all. I was done with their drama, their selfishness. That night, I lay in my new bed, the silence a stark contrast to the chaos of my former life. I smiled to myself, thinking about Alex and Mrs. Thompson struggling with the kids. It was their turn to feel overwhelmed, to be pushed to their limits. The aftermath of my departure turned out to be more dramatic than any scene from my books. My phone buzzed constantly with updates from various friends who couldn't resist sharing the chaos unfolding at my former residence. One evening, as I sat in my new apartment, the phone rang with an all-too-familiar number. It was Alex, and from the background noise, I could tell the situation at home was far from under control. Mary, you have to come back. These kids are monsters. Alex's voice was desperate, strained with frustration. I could hear the sounds of things crashing and children screaming. A smirk crept onto my face. Really, Alex? Sounds like you're having a fun time. This isn't funny, Mary. My mom is losing her mind, and I can't handle this alone, he pleaded. I leaned back, enjoying the sweet taste of retribution. Well, Alex, you should have thought about that before. I'm not your nanny or your maid. There was a pause, and then he said, I'm sorry, okay? I should have listened to you, respected your work. Please, just come back. The apology, so rare from Alex, didn't stir any sympathy in me. Sorry doesn't fix everything, Alex. I told you what would happen. I'm done being taken for granted. I hung up, cutting off his protests. The satisfaction was short-lived, though, replaced by a sense of peace and freedom. A few days later, I met up with Lucy for coffee. So, I heard Mrs. Thompson called Susan, demanding she come back early to take her kids, Lucy said, a mischievous glint in her eyes. I laughed, sipping my coffee. Yeah, Susan refused. Said she needed the break. Can you imagine the showdown at that house? Lucy chuckled. And your book? It's a hit, Mary. Everyone's talking about it. I smiled, feeling a sense of achievement wash over me. I put everything into it. It's my best work yet. Lucy leaned in, lowering her voice. The main villain, she's a lot like your mother-in-law, isn't she? I raised an eyebrow, a playful smirk on my lips. Is she? I hadn't noticed. As I walked back to my apartment, I thought about the journey I had been on. Leaving Alex and his controlling family was the best decision I had ever made. I was finally living for myself, my dreams. My latest book was just the start. The villain, reminiscent of Mrs. Thompson, was a hit with the readers. My friends saw the resemblance immediately, but for me, it was more than that. It was a cathartic release, a way to close a painful chapter of my life.